Why did the Israelites want a king? Why did things go so badly when they got one? What happened with the two kingdoms? Why were they divided? And why is the story of Israel so sad sometimes? We're going to look at that as we look at lots and lots of kings in the book of Kings and Chronicles as well, with Ted Wright from Epic Archaeology on today's Theology on Air. Well, thanks for joining us today. Ted, thanks for joining us again. You've come on before to talk about the Exodus once or twice, I think, maybe. But anyway.
Yeah.
Several times. So, former seminary professor. He's the executive director of Epic Archaeology, which is a Facebook page. I'd encourage you to, well, it's a website, but you'll see their Facebook posts as well. You might have some Facebook pastes. I don't know. I don't know how that one would do that. But anyway, Facebook posts to keep in touch with what they're up to, including some controversial posts about Canaanites from what I gather, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah,
maybe you can explain that. You like tried to explain what a Canaanite was, and people gave you all kinds of grief about it. It was kind of weird.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, I didn't realize how hot that topic was in the Middle East and in the world. People want to politicize everything, and they want to politicize that. And there's no longer any Canaanites living today, but people want to think that they are, and people have sympathies for the Canaanites. So I didn't know that. I didn't know there were people who there was a fan club of the Canaanites, but apparently there are.
Yeah. Well, there's always somebody for the underdog, So
exactly.
But well, let's jump in. Let's set the stage a little bit. We did a podcast on Judges most recently in this kind of series. Every month we want to take a look at a portion of the Bible, a book, or like today we're probably going to look at several books. But we stopped with Judges. Judges ends sort of ominously with everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. And one of the things that's very clear from a cursory reading of the Old Testament is that Israel has some very bad habits and some very bad patterns of falling back into idolatry and sort of promising not to do it ever again and then doing it again. It's like the kid who keeps getting their hand caught in the cookie jar. But we talked about these judges who aren't really judges per se, but these sort of saviors of Israel who sort of come up, and God ultimately is regarded as the king. And we do have 1st and 2nd Samuel before that. So Samuel has to deal a lot with the kings as well. So really our topic today is probably more the kings than the book of 1st and 2nd Kings per se, since again, some of the material kind of doubles and chronicles and so on and so forth. But maybe kind of set the stage where we're at in Israel's history at this time. Where have we been? Where are we going to kind of go? And where are they when Israel gets to that point where they say, hey, we'd like a king?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to do is set two contexts, Evan, for the listeners. And this is a subject that can go down a lot of rabbit trails. So when I taught Old Testament survey years ago, one of my challenges every semester was to try to simplify as much as I can, because it's a lot of information to try to get across an entire semester. And so this is a lot of information to try to get across in a podcast.
Sure.
So I'll try to hit the high points and as I see them. And let me just make a blanket statement to start out with. And I think this is still generally true. I've taught this years ago, and I think it's still true today. And so years ago when I taught Old Testament, you got to cover 33 books in one semester. So that's a tough thing to do. And you got prophets, you've got poetry, you've got all this stuff. But what I said back then, and one of the conclusions that I came to, Evan, was that in order to understand the Old Testament, you really need to understand 5 books. That really gives you, it's like the key to unlock the entire Old Testament. And it's the Torah, not surprisingly. It's the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the same can be said when understanding the Kings and the prophets and the historical books, because all of those books, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, all of them look back to the Torah, and specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, which interestingly enough, I know we're recording this live, and I'm not sure when this will actually be on the air. We're technically on air now, but we're coming up on 4th of July weekend, in which America celebrates its independence from Great Britain. Of course, America has a Constitution and a Declaration of Independence. Israel, as a nation, they were set aside by God. They were a theocracy. They were a nation. They were a kingdom of priests, and they didn't have a president. They had God. Literally, God was their president, if you will. He was their king, and so that was the purpose of it. And what God's intention, when you read in Deuteronomy and also in Leviticus and other books in the Torah, was God's intention was that their national identity would be coextensive with their spiritual identity. And many of them had begun to think, well, if I'm just born a Jew, if I'm born a son of Abraham, then I'm really a Jew. Of course, Christ makes a point, and of course the Apostle Paul in the New Testament makes a point that just because you're born a Jew doesn't mean you're actually saved. Mm-hmm. But what God intended was that their national identity and their spiritual identity be one and the same. Because in the prophet Isaiah, when Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah says, you're bringing me these sacrifices and you're bringing me all these things, and why are you doing this? I'm sick of the sacrifices, God's saying. So we're like, wait a minute, aren't you the one to tell us to bring the sacrifices? And what God says is, what I really want is your heart. What I really want is you to just trust me, just to believe what I say. Just trust me and have faith. So all that to say, we go all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy, which actually outlines, for lack of a better word, a constitution, if you will, for Israel and the way they should have existed as a nation, specifically under a king. Because you remember when Deuteronomy was given, it was written by, of course, most conservative scholars believe Deuteronomy was written by Moses and was given to the Israelite nation as they're about on the plains of Moab. They're about to enter the promised land. This is way back before they actually enter the land. And in fact, Moses outlines in Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning in verses 14 through 20, he actually outlines the principles of a king. And which is odd because, God told him, I don't want you to have a king, but there may come a time in which you might want a king. But if you do have a king, here's how the king should conduct himself. And so I'll just read a few things here, a few verses, just to sort of let people know what it says. It says in verse 14, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14. It says, when you come to the land in which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it to dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, the Lord your God chooses, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, who God chooses, not who you choose, which is very interesting. Because, we already know right there from that verse, like verse 15, that's the very first king, is that they picked a king, King Saul, because he looked like a king. So it sort of sounds similar, doesn't it? We pick kings today because they look like a president or whatever. Well, Israel's the same way.
Absolutely. The studies on, like every president has been over like 6'1" or something like that, especially in the TV era, that sort of thing does seem to matter. So, yeah.
Exactly. So basically he says in verse 15, you shall pick a king who God chooses from among your brethren. You shall set a king over you. It says you may not set up a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall, and it also says in verse 16, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall you multiply wives. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver or gold for himself. And it shall also be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of the law, copy of the Torah. So the king was supposed to have a copy of the Torah beside him. Why is that? It says, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, and he shall learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart might not be lifted up among his brethren, and that he may not turn aside to the commandment, to the right hand or the left, and he may prolong his days and his kingdom and his children in the midst of Israel. The reason why I go into great lengths to quote this in Deuteronomy 17 is because when we come to Kings, and we look at all the kings of Israel and Judah, this is the standard. This is the standard that God has. Yeah. So we look at kings and we wonder, well, why did God do this? Well, here's why. Because God already said, when you do these things, I'm going to kick you off the throne, and I'm going to put kings who will actually honor me. When God does pick a king, of course, that king does honor him. But of course, we also see that they're humans like everybody else. And even in their dysfunction, God still works, such as the case of David. So that's sort of the theological context of First and Second Kings, as well as the rest of the Old Testament and the prophets. But then also, Evan, if I can, I would like to also give sort of the historical context of the kings as well, as we're sort of setting up, like what kind of culture did they sort of live in? Where do they sort of where do they exist in? Well, this comes from archaeology and from history, and it's something that historians and archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Beginning in about the year 1177 to about 1200 BC, there were a enormous group of people called the Sea Peoples that basically invaded Canaan and Levant and Egypt and all throughout the ancient Near East. In fact, there's a really good popular level book on this by a professor at George Washington University named Eric Klein, and it's called 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, the reason why he said that is because through archaeology, what we discovered is that there was really an extensive trade network through the ancient Near East during the period of the Judges. So during the period that you guys just covered in your previous podcast on the Judges, what's happening in Israel is that there was a massive inflow. There's a lot of things going on, and there was a lot of destabilization going on, which historically actually allowed the Israelites to come into the land, and that's when the Judges period sort of existed. So you have the rise of the Philistines, which the Egyptians called them the Peliset, and you have the Sea Peoples that actually came from Crete. Another interesting thing about this, Evan, is that it was from Crete, which is really Greece. These Sea Peoples came into Israel, and of course we see this. We'll get to this later when we talk about David and David's confrontation of Goliath of Gath, who was a Philistine. We have this sort of epic battle between these two heroes. Of course, one is David; he was a little boy, and the other one was Goliath of Gath. This is in really the height of epic battles, and we know one of the greatest battles that was known about in the ancient world was that's recorded in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, and the battle between Hector and Achilles on the walls of Troy. And if you ever seen the movie with Brad Pitt, it's a pretty decent movie about this. Yeah. They had this epic battle between Hector and Achilles, and so this idea of heroes fighting one another is also in the text, and you read about this, and this is in the context of when this all took place. So this is really, really cool stuff. So this is what's going on historically in Israel at the time when the kings really started to come into play. When King Saul was, of course, picked by Israel, the Philistines were really coming into place, and they actually settled along the coast of the present day Gaza Strip, which is there in southern Israel along the coastline. So that's sort of the historical context of the kings.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it is close to Independence Day for us, where we threw off our king.
That's right.
What would it have taken? Of course, we have bureaucrats that are far worse than kings today. We all know that now, I think. But what would it take? What would it take for a nation to desire to want a king? What do you think kind of compelled the Israelites to say, the judges were nice, and God, I guess you're okay, but we really want a king. And it says explicitly to be like other nations. Yeah. And it says, I just preached on this recently, of something like, He will fight our battles for us. And I've often wondered what in the world that meant. I mean, you still had to go out and fight, because Samuel says, right, he famously warns them, okay, if you have a king, he's going to put your men into service. He's going to take all of your tithes and give it to all of his bureaucrats, all of the yes men. Jerusalem is going to become a city of government officials. Grifters, I think, would be a popular name for it today. Grifters, people, the worst kind of people, right? Political money, and your women are going to end up in, the king's courts and so on and so forth. And so Samuel tries to warn them against this, but they seem to think they'll sort of have it on easy street. And I've always kind of tried to figure out, well, why? What was it that a king would do for them that that they couldn't do without a king? Would he hire like foreign armies to fight their battles for them? Or would
Yep.
they, or did they just want a strong man? And there's a lot that could be said about the desire for strong men in times of political upheaval. But anyway, what do you think kind of motivated this desire to want a king?
Here's the thing: is when you look at ancient history, and the more that I read historical accounts and in other accounts as well, in not just here in the Scripture in the Old Testament, but also in Babylonian and Assyrian sources and Egyptian sources as well. The one thing that's really amazing, Evan, is that human nature has not changed in millennia since
Yeah,
forever. Forever, we're the
yeah,
same.
yeah,
We're basically the
yeah.
same, and it's the same question that we asked today: why do people not trust God today? Because they want to have assurance that everything's going to be okay. And so it really comes down to, specifically for Israel, because this is a unique situation, that God set this nation aside to essentially make his name great and to be their king. So they're very unique. I think a lot of times we in America sort of mistake that we think that we're Israel. We're not Israel. The
Mm,
promises that were given to Israel are not given to the United States. And I think a lot of
right.
American evangelicals sort of take that notion. But what makes people pick a king? You hit it. You hit the nail on the head, Evan, when you said it's because when you're living in the land in the time in which they live, it's hard for us to imagine this, but if you're living in a land, 3,000 years ago, and you have foreign armies that are prowling around your cities, and they have weapons that of mass destruction, if you will,
Mhm.
is in the case of the Neo-Assyrians. They had battering rams. They had a very well-oiled army, machinery of war. When you look around at this, you're like, we better get somebody to really gather us together. I mean, they should have trusted God, but they wanted someone to, as the case of Saul, sort of unite them against a common enemy. So it's human nature that you want someone to sort of bring them together, and I think that's what really the cause of it was. And I think that when you look at, because there's a lot of kings, of course, in Old Testament scholarship, there's a big debate, and maybe we'll get to this. Did you want to talk about the minimalism maximalism debate in Old Testament scholarship? Do you know? Are you familiar with that?
No, not by name.
Okay, so back in the late 80s, early 90s, it really comes from originated, I think, in Copenhagen, Denmark. I'm not positive where it originated, but I know that it was. There are two scholars there at the University of Copenhagen, Niels Peter Lemke and Thomas Thompson. There are others in America as well, John Van Cedars, other Old Testament scholars in Israel, be Israel Finkelstein, who's at Tel Aviv University. But essentially, the debate among Old Testament archaeologists and Near Eastern scholars is whether or not there really was a monarchy as it's described in the Old Testament, such as
Mm,
David and Solomon. Did
mm,
that, we read about it, that King David was a great king, King Saul, and the Solomonic Empire. But in the archaeological record, it's up for debate as to whether or not this actually existed. And so there's kind of given rise to two camps among scholars. One group is called the biblical minimalist, and they're originating out of Denmark, and the other group are called the maximalist, and they believe that the Old Testament is pretty much accurate when it describes David and Solomon. So this all came to a head. There's a lot of literature that was written on this, and so essentially, and I'm just going to summarize this really quickly here. But the minimalists are really they've really been affected by postmodern philosophy, in particular the philosophy of Derrida and Foucault, who were postmodern philosophers. And what this means in English is that when they look at the Old Testament text, they see it as purely just poetic. There's
mm.
no history to it whatsoever. So the only thing that we have is the archaeology. And if it doesn't, it's not proved by archaeology, then there's no reality to the text at all. In fact, they even go to great lengths. The irony is, Evan, that these minimalist scholars, they write 400-page long books to say that language can't be trusted.
Yeah.
You see the irony there?
Yeah.
They say
No point in reading their book then, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they also say that as soon as someone writes it down, then it becomes historical and place bound, and then you really can't trust it. Well, now that book's 25 years old, so we can't trust anything it says.
Right.
So, but of course, they don't think that their books fall into that criticism. So anyway, that's the extreme side of things, and the maximalists would be people like Dr. Bill Deaver, who is at formerly the University of Arizona, and then others as well. And then there are sort of gradations of the maximalists, because there are some maximalist scholars who believe that David and Solomon really did exist, but that anything before David and Solomon, such as the Exodus and conquest, there's really minimal historical evidence for that at all. So even among the maximalists, there's sort of a gradation of scholars and conservatives and sort of more progressive scholars on that. So so the key, though, let me just get to the point here, is that is in I believe it was in 1961. I got to remember the date on this, but I know where it was. It was in Tel Dan in northern Israel. An archaeologist by the name of Abraham B. Ram discovered at Tel Dan an inscription containing the name of David. It was one of the first uncontested archaeological discoveries that actually affirmed the existence of King David, and so that sort of shut their mouths for a little bit, and they have to basically concede that there really was a David. It's sort of like the Jesus mythicists who say that Jesus never existed. It's sort of in that same vein, except it's Old Testament. So so the archaeology now really.
I'm just hoping we don't find the tomb with Jesus' bones in it to prove the mythos is wrong, because that would be really unfortunate for me, since I put all my hope in his resurrection. But let me ask this. Did they not find the fortress of David and the city of David? And the city of David, in fact, I was just doing a Bible study last night, and one of the people on it works in Israel quite a bit. And I gather the city of David was just outside of Jerusalem. I mean, maybe when they say things like the city of David, it's almost coterminous with Jerusalem now. But anyway, didn't they find a pretty massive fortress or something recently?
Okay, well, yes and no. The city of David, so Jerusalem is on a hill. It's Mount Zion is the tallest point in Jerusalem. It's on several hills, and so the current Temple Mount today, if people look at a picture of Jerusalem, they see the Dome of the Rock, that gold dome that was actually built by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in like the 7th century AD. So that is where the top part of the Temple Mount is today. The city of David sort of goes along sort of a ridge just a little bit below that. And it's where we believe historically that David's palace existed, that Solomon's palace existed. And but because there's been so much destruction and occupation in Jerusalem, the time of David has not been established firmly on archaeological grounds. The only thing we do have for sure is something called the Millo, Millo, in the city of David, and this was a revetment wall that supported the revetment wall actually does date to the 10th century BC. That actually does support the existence of a fairly large palace complex in the 10th and 9th century BC, which is when David and Solomon would have existed. So again, that's what we know archaeologically. And in fact, I don't think anybody doubts that there was a David and Solomon. Most scholars do think he existed. The question is the extent of his kingdom and how big was it? Was it a large kingdom? Was it a small? I think a lot of people think that David's kingdom was sort of like he was like King Arthur, and that there was this massive thing. But it's true. I mean, Israel at the time of David and Solomon was not a huge, it wasn't a huge country. So it was fairly small considering, the other nations of the time, such as Assyria or the Philistines and some other groups as well, and Egypt. But there was another recent discovery found in Israel that really connects David. Since we're talking about David, I'll go ahead and mention this. It's a place in Israel called Khirbet Kiafa, and it was excavated by an Israeli archaeologist by the name of Garfinkel. His name is Yosef Garfinkel, and it dates to the late Iron Age. So in the archaeological record, David and Solomon exist in the Iron Age. And so this is actually, we believe, it's actually in the text itself when David actually confronts Goliath of Gath there on the valley of Elah. It mentions a fortress that has two gates. And this discovery was made by Joseph Garfinkel, and it matches exactly what we see. There's no other building in Israel at that time. And there is some debate among Garfinkel and another archaeologist. I think she's at Tel Aviv University. I'm not sure where she is. Her name is Lily Singer Avitz. And so the debate is really just a fine-tuning debate as to whether or not the site actually dates the time of King Saul or King David. What an article that I have, another scholar that I follow, actually believes that the site itself was continuously occupied during the time of King Saul, which would have been in existence when David fought Goliath, and then also a few years under David's reign, and then fell out of disuse when David consolidated his power there in Judah. So, yeah, well, and that place is called Kirbet Kiafa.
Well, two things. As it happens, our reading on Sunday is 2 Samuel 5, which mentions the Milo, which you had mentioned earlier, in 2 Samuel 5, 9. And it's talking about basically David conquering this area from the Jebusites.
Jebusites, that's right.
Yeah, because they were there first, and the Jebusites were very arrogant and thinking. And this is now David has consolidated his power. In fact, we're going to go backwards in time just a minute from here, but just as a reference, they thought, no, David can't possibly conquer us, and then of course he does. But let's go back a little bit. Let's say that someone really knows very little about the kings.
Okay.
Let's just lay some very big kind of picture groundwork.
Sure.
So as I said, so at the end of Judges, the people are sort of going their own way. They decide they want a king. We've talked about that a little bit. The first king is Saul. We've talked about that. They choose Saul. Saul is tall and handsome, you might say. And interestingly, he and David have a very close relationship. And I say that's interesting because they will soon be, Saul will be trying to kill David before too long. And so interestingly, there's a 15-year period. I didn't realize it was this long until I, again, read for my sermon this week. But there's a 15-year period where David is anointed as king in 2 Samuel 5, where all of Israel, all of the tribes come together and acknowledge him as king.
Yes.
But there was a 15-year period prior to that where he had already been anointed by Samuel to be the king. But Saul was still the king. And so maybe just give a kind of overview of Saul, kind of big accomplishments and kind of his character. I think his character is actually a lot more interesting than what battles he won or what kind of went on. But he reads the Bible just beautifully portrayed. I mean, beautifully, tragically. I mean, he's a quintessential tragic hero in many respects, right? And that he has this fundamental personal flaw that hinders him greatly. So maybe just talk a little bit about who Saul was and really what his downfall was.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of touched on this earlier. He was, like you said, I think he started out good, like many people. I think God. Here's the thing: when you look at the history of Israel, and specifically when you look at King Saul, when you look at the judges, and you look at all of these people that God dealt with, he dealt with flawed individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, all the way back to Jacob. I mean, everybody, Adam and Eve, us, we're all flawed. We're all messed up. And I look at it this way. It's sort of a kind of a very, I don't know how the word I'm using to describe here. We're dysfunctional. I mean, we are dysfunctional people. We're fallen over sin. Saul was the same way. And Saul started out, I think he meant well, and I think he wanted to do well. But like everyone else, he thought he knew what was best. And it comes back to what we were reading in Deuteronomy chapter 17 about the king and what the king should have done. And on a couple of occasions, I mean, you got to realize he wasn't just the political leader. And I think that's where the problem that a lot of the kings that we see in Judah and Israel make, and it's the problem that Saul made as well, is that he thought he was merely the political leader, merely the military leader. He wasn't just the military leader, he was the spiritual leader as well. And as the spiritual leader, he should have trusted God. He should have led the nation not just in their military victories, but their military victories should have stemmed from his trust in God.
Yeah.
Was he going to be a king who trusted God? Because when you look at later, and again, I'm going to jump ahead here for a minute. When you look at the covenant that God makes with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, he's going to make he made the covenant with David because he was a man after God's own heart. And that's what God wants. God wants a man after his own heart. And of course, we see that covenant with David is an eternal covenant, and Christ is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. So he is the king who's going to not only lead Israel militarily, but also spiritually as well. And he did that when he came, and he's going to do that militarily at one point. But to come back to Saul, on several occasions in which he was actually waiting for Samuel when he was fighting the Philistines. They were going to give a sacrifice before the battle, and Samuel's not around, so of course Saul gives the sacrifice, and this displeased Samuel because he was really he wasn't. What does the law say? What does the Torah state? That only the Levites could actually give the sacrifice. So
Samuel was a prophet and a priest.
That's right.
Is that right? Okay.
Correct. Yes. He was a prophet and a priest. So according to the scripture, according to the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Leviticus, the only person who was allowed to give the sacrifice would have been at that time Samuel. But as they were waiting on the Philistines, King Saul decided to give this as well. And then on another occasion, in fact, it even says, to go back to Deuteronomy 17 and other passages in the Old Testament, that they are to wipe out the Canaanites and not let them survive. In fact, they are to I know you guys covered this with Paul Copan and perhaps when you talked about the Canaanite genocide question, but on one occasion when they captured Agag, Saul was supposed to kill the king, and he didn't do it. And so again, he disobeyed the voice of the Lord. So God rejected him and pulled the kingdom from his hands. And so you sort of alluded to this earlier that so even though he was technically still on the throne, he had been rejected by God, and God was then going to be looking for someone else. And then, of course, Samuel then goes to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, and asks for the sons, and they bring all the sons before him. And they say, he says, do you have anybody else? Yeah, we got this runt. He's back there keeping the sheep. We'll bring him up here. And so sure enough, David comes forward, and he says, you're the one. And of course, man looks on the outside, but God looks at the heart. And what God wanted was a man after his own heart. Even though he was a little boy, he was a little shepherd kid. God chose him to lead his nation. So I think this is a great lesson in really what God wants. And it's easy for us because we're looking back in time. But when you're living through this, if you were an Israelite living at the time, you're sort of learning this as you go. But it comes back to the Torah. It comes back to the what does the scripture actually say? And it actually states that if you're going to have a king, he should follow God. Saul did not follow God, so God rejected him as the king.
Yeah,
and God went to David.
Now, when did Saul find out that David was anointed to be king? Because is this kind of the beginning of the downfall of their relationship? I mean, David played music in Saul's court. I mean,
yes,
there are these almost humorous. I mean, it's hard not to read them as comedies almost, but I don't think they're meant to be. But where Saul throws his spear at David as he's angry, as David's playing music for him. I mean, here's David just trying to play some music for him on his harp to soothe Saul's conscience or whatever. And Saul gets so angry that he throws his spear at him. But David is quick and crafty, and he moves out of the way. So they have this bizarre relationship. And by the way, David is very good friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. No, they were not lovers. They were something that is very rare in the 21st century, which is they were two men who were very good friends.
Yep.
You don't see that much anymore. But sociologically, that is a fact. That is a dying reality. But it was a very real thing in previous centuries where men actually considered friendship to be a wonderful thing. Anyway, but talk about when and why did Saul and David's relationship really fall apart?
So it's recorded in 1 Samuel 17, 18, and 19, right in those chapters. And what we see is just, again, human nature on display with Saul. God begins, now again, they know each other, And as you stated, David is not only is he a shepherd, but he's also a poet and a musician. He plays the harp.
Hmm.
So Saul was tormented by, of course, an evil spirit. David went into the tent, consoled him and sang and things like that. And then, of course, after the incident at the Valley of Elah, where David confronts Goliath of Gath and defeats him,
Oh,
then
yes.
the fame of David really gets
Yeah.
up there. And then at some point, as David enters Jerusalem, the ladies of the city say, Saul has slain his thousands of David his tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And then the praise, it's sort of like, if you're going to put it in modern day social media terms, David had more Twitter followers than Saul. He had more.
It's like when Maximus, defeats the barbarian horde, right?
Exactly.
And
that's a great connection.
Yeah. And Commodus is like, oh crap, I haven't done anything.
Yeah, it's a great connection. Yeah, the battle's already over with. Commodus gets there late, and then they're all blooded. The soldiers were bloody from the battle, and he's like, did I miss it? And he goes, the battle's already over. We've won.
Yeah. I shall slaughter 1,000 bulls for you. Save the bulls. Honor Maximus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what's going on with David. And David is David's starting to get some praise and starting to get some love from the people of Jerusalem and the people of Israel. And then Saul gets really jealous of this, and he sees this. And so then he seeks to take David's life. And this is interesting. You mentioned Evan, because it's sort of a rabbit trail sort of subject, which we won't get into because I know we want to move on. But it is interesting to me. I think about this a lot. Actually, it's an interesting thing because I do some tangential reading in philosophy of history and also political philosophy. It is interesting that you've heard the statement, "Power corrupts." Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is interesting that when you give men power, when you get it, they have a powerful position. It does affect them. It affects us. I mean, it affects everybody, even on a smaller scale. If you're given authority, that's why I think sometimes it's really dangerous when you give someone a badge and a gun. As a police officer, your human nature, and you're going to have, that for some people that comes out, and you end up seeing that. And I think that happens also on the political scale as well. And I think, of course, with King Saul, he is jealous, and no matter how good David is, he's still on the throne. He wants to take David out. Yeah. And so even though his son, even his own son, Jonathan, loves David, and a couple of occasions, David actually recognizes Saul's right to the kingship, even though David had already been anointed by Samuel. And on a couple of occasions, he actually cut the garment off of Saul. He was in a cave using the restroom, living himself, and David was there hidden out, and he actually cut the garment of Saul and said, listen, I could have taken you out, but I didn't, because I recognize you're the Lord's anointed. But even then, Saul did not want anything to do with David.
And then when Saul is finally killed in a battle, he asks someone to kill him. I guess so it'd be in some way an honorable death. I can't remember. But anyway, if I remember correctly, either someone who witnesses the murder of Saul or the guy who kills Saul, he goes to David to curry favor and says, hey, I've done your bidding. I've killed Saul, who was trying to kill you for all those years. Right. I mean, that's why David and Saul ended up in this cave together, because David is hiding from Saul. Right. And Saul has to relieve himself. So, but David refuses to kill Saul. I mean, refuses. Yeah. And he even kills this guy who goes to David and says, I've killed Saul. He's like, how dare you kill the guy who's trying to kill me? He's the Lord's anointed. You don't get to do that. Up. Isn't that it's just crazy? So it's like you do see these things in David where it's like, I get it. I know what you mean when you say he's a man after God's own heart, because he really is loyal and he really does possess these virtues. Now we'll talk about Bathsheba maybe, but that's not the case there. But in this moment, he refuses. And there's this great line. We just read it on Sunday because we're moving our way through the lectionary, and we're in the Samuel, obviously. And it's David singing this song at the death of Saul. And he says, I think 3 times, it's like a refrain in the song, how the mighty have fallen.
How the mighty have fallen. Beautiful passage.
Yeah. And people hear that now. And it's just part of our lexicon now. But he's singing that about Saul. Yeah. It's remarkable how the mighty have fallen. It's a song of lament. I mean, if someone's trying to kill me, right, and then they die, I'm like, oh, heaven, Thank you. That isn't his response at all. It's fascinating.
Yeah. How can you do how again, it's if you know the Lord, you have that capacity to love
Yeah.
those who don't love you. And it's something that the world doesn't understand.
Yeah.
And that's a great episode in the Old Testament of that example.
By the way, didn't David marry one of Saul's daughters?
He did.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know that it was a happy marriage, but because Bathsheba comes in later. Anyway, I can't get all the marriages straight. They married lots of people.
Yeah.
So
it's like a Jerry Springer episode.
yeah. Well, let's quickly just mention the Bathsheba episode. If we're going to talk about kings and David, we must. The very long story short is that David sees Bathsheba bathing. Now, there's people go back and forth on. They'll say, well, David was a peeping Tom, sort of.
Mhm.
People obviously did a lot on their roof. I don't know if people realize that
Mhm.
it was like a room of the house almost. You used every square foot you could get. And other people will say Bathsheba was sort of seducing him, that she knew that he could be watching or something. I don't know that you could prove that either way, but the bottom line is that they relate to one another. Bathsheba's husband Uriah, she gets pregnant. Bathsheba's husband Uriah is a very loyal soldier of David's.
Yes.
And David realizes he's got a problem because she's pregnant with David's child, and he doesn't want this discovered. So he essentially has Uriah killed.
Yeah.
And so basically, if we add up all the 10 commandments that David has broken, there's coveting, there's adultery, there's murder, etc.
Yes.
So what maybe kind of offer a few thoughts on that episode, maybe what to take away from it.
It's interesting. I want to come back to there's a lot that you could share on that, but I want to come back to what I think is the most important thing, Evan, on this, and that is the theological understanding that David eventually gets about God, because we see him young, trusting God, and then the power goes to his head as well. And I think that's what happened. I think the power went to his head, just like everybody else, just like Saul, and he forgets his relationship with God. He begins to think that, well, he just has this thing with God and that everything's going to be great. And if he just goes through the motions of sacrifice, then everything's going to be well. And of course, it's when Nathan the prophet confronts David about this adulterous relationship with Uriah the Hittite, which is another little side note real quickly, just as a side note here, as a footnote in our conversation. The Hittites were only known about in the Old Testament for about 2,000 years. And then they disappeared off the historical radar. In 1909, a German archaeologist by the name of Hugo Winkler discovered the ancient city of Hattusha in Turkey, ends up being the entire Hittite capital. And there's a library that was discovered there with the Hittite language. Here in Chicago, the University of Chicago with the Oriental Institute sent archaeologists up there, and they actually had one of their top archaeologists back last century was Dr. Robert Braidwood. Braidwood did a lot of work in Turkey, but in any case, he didn't do work at Hattusha. But anyway, so that really showed, that was one of the very first archaeological discoveries that showed the reliability of the Old Testament in 1909 was the discovery of the Hittites. Uriah was a Hittite. That was the husband of Bathsheba. But I want to come back to the theological aspects of this. So later in David's life, after the episode with Bathsheba, he actually captures the Ark of the Covenant back from the Philistines because it had been captured when Saul was defeated. Then David eventually gets it back, and he's on the way back to Jerusalem to take the Ark of the Covenant back, and they're sacrificing a bull every 7 steps. So every 7 steps on the way to the temple platform, a bull's blood is. Can you imagine the blood and the gore? Okay, so this is.
They're taking like really long steps. Like, man, that's a lot of beef.
That's a lot of brisket. It's a lot of brisket from Texas. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So it was a gory mess. This is before we think David was confronted by Nathan the prophet. Then we read in Psalm 53 what was going on in David's head when after Nathan confronts David about this relationship. He it's not the blood of bulls and goats you want, Lord. It's a broken and contrite heart. That's what you really want.
Is it Psalm 51?
Psalm 51, I think it is.
Oh,
yes. So I said 53. I meant 51. Yeah, it's the lament. It's the lament of David, where he's confronted with King Saul. He confesses his sin, and he says, "Lord, against only you have I sinned, and done great evil in your sight." So, even though David did sin, there's no whitewashing that over. He was a great sinner, but it's also an indication that God is merciful and kind and gracious and compassionate, and that even in our failings, he is able to work. And this is evidence also in the fact, Evan, that this is just amazing. One of my challenges that I give when I taught Old Testament for about 13 or 14 years down in Charlotte, North Carolina, I would always challenge my students at the very beginning of the semester to, I would ask them this question. I would say, the God of the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament, which one is more mean and which one is nicer? And they would always say, "Oh, it's easy. Jesus is much nicer than the God of the Old Testament." And I'm like, "Okay, well, after this semester, I hope you change your mind." And we would look at episode after episode in which God has mercy, grace, grace, grace. And there are so many, and this is one of those episodes. And one example of this, there are so many of them, but one example with David's life is that, okay, in the adulterous relationship between David and Bathsheba, when God makes a covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the covenant promise is going to go to, guess which son? It's the son of the adulterous relationship between him and Bathsheba.
Ah, wow.
Solomon. I mean, why? But it's because God is a God of grace and a God of mercy. And we don't know why God does the things he does, but he chose Solomon. And we see this. In fact, there were people even then to throw sand about, like, why would God do this? Why would God choose this? I mean, he's the son of a relationship between they had adultery together. Why would God? No, this can't be the case. We actually read in, I believe it's in Samuel and Kings, where this is so cool. So right on David's deathbed, as David was about to die, there was some basically a squabble that broke out, because it's important in the ancient Near East who was going to have the inheritance. This is true not only just in Judah and Israel, but also in Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, all of the cultures in the ancient Near East. Your descendants, your male descendants, are going to be the ones to succeed you. And so they knew that David was getting ready to die. And so Bathsheba, of course, Nathan had already said that it's going to be through Solomon that God's going to keep the covenant, and he's going to pass the covenant through. So she was worried. She had gotten a message that there were some rumblings that somebody's going to try to usurp Solomon off the throne, and that you need to really make a point to pinpoint Solomon as your successor. You know how David did this? Remember how he did it? He had Solomon saddle my donkey and have him ride through the streets of Jerusalem on my donkey. When Jesus rides through Jerusalem on the back of the donkey, he's pointing back to David, saying, "I am the rightful successor to the throne of Israel."
Fascinating.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, that's interesting. I never put those two together.
Yeah.
We have maybe 10 minutes or so, and we haven't even gotten to Solomon. I did want to point one thing out, though. I'm going back to your I never recognized this in Deuteronomy at all. We started with Deuteronomy 17, which is interesting, right? Because they didn't have kings yet, and yet here we are saying something about kings. And I'm thinking about Solomon. Here's looking at you, Solomon, because it says, you know where I'm going with this, right?
Yes, I do. Go ahead.
Let's see. It says, well, here it is. It says he should not have many wives, but I can't find it. I saw it, and now I can't see it.
Verse 17.
17. Yeah, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excess silver and gold. And actually,
also not to multiply horses. At Tel Megiddo in northern Israel, archaeologists excavating there found stables for horses built during the time of Solomon. So not only did he multiply wives, he multiplied horses and stables.
It's like the really rich people now who have garages like 100 classic cars. Back in the old day, it'd be like horses. I want more horses.
He had a Mercedes chariot.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and actually, as I read this, actually, I think about First Timothy 3 too. The elders and deacons, right?
Yeah.
The life of simplicity, of modesty, not loving money, a husband and one wife, things of this nature. There are these sort of through lines for biblical leadership, and so on and so forth. But Solomon's sort of great downfall apparently was he loved women. He had something like 700 wives and concubines altogether, and this ultimately seems to lead him to worship other gods. How does that worship exactly, or how does that work exactly? Is it that he's got all these other women that he can't say no to, and so they bring in idolatrous practices and ideas that he just has a hard time denying, and so the faithfulness that the people of Israel are supposed to have to God is just gone?
Yeah, I think so. It actually again comes all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy, all the way back to actually in the Garden of Eden. I think the connection can even be made in the Garden of Eden. I think on our previous podcast that I was on with you guys, we were talking about the. I know we talked about this, but I'll mention it. In the Garden of Eden, when Satan tempted Eve, it says the fruit was beautiful, or the Hebrew word is tov, and she took fruit and she gave it to her husband. The same language is given in Genesis chapter 6. When the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, Genesis 6:1, they took wives, plural, for themselves,
Mm,
and they began to multiply, and they began to create men of renown, or men of
mm,
great name, uh, prideful, arrogant men of power. So this offspring, the Nephilim, which I know is a big controversial subject, you guys have talked about that as well. But the point here is that they were commanded all the way back before the Exodus, and even during the Exodus, do not intermarry with the Canaanites. When
mm.
you intermarry with them, the beauty of their women are going to cause you to then worship other gods. And so it's really sort of a practical matter. I know that's going to sound really, really bad of me to say this, but when mama's happy, everybody's happy. So
Yeah.
when you got a bunch of wives and they are worshiping Canaanite gods, in order to make the household run well, you're going to want to go along with her. And we see this really come to a head with Ahab and Jezebel.
Yeah.
Ahab, of course, being the son of Omri, who was a usurper in Judah, in Israel, the north. And this was because Omri had made a political alliance with the Phoenicians. Again, this is after the divided kingdom, and he
We should
married.
say very quickly that you have these three kings that we focused on so much: Saul, David, and Solomon,
Right.
and they do reign over a kind of united Israel, like all more or less the 12 tribes are together.
Yes.
Did Israel and Judah sort of exist separately to some degree? Like they recognized like there was the north and the south, and there was a difference.
Well, the split happened when Solomon died in what is the year? I got it written down right here, in 930 BC. So Jeroboam led the northern tribes to separate from Judah, who were under Rehoboam, to establish a separate kingdom. Jeroboam set up a capital at Tirzah in the north in Syria. So they did separate. So Jeroboam was in the north, Rehoboam was in the south, and they began to develop separately politically and spiritually. Israel had their own thing, and they struggle with Canaanite worship, Canaanite goddess worship, and worship of Asherah and Baal, and we see this extensively in the archaeological record. We have also actually discovered the signet ring, not me personally, but archaeologists have discovered the signet ring of Ahab and the seal of Jezebel. And this is a direct archaeological confirmation of Jezebel. These are the kings that existed after the division of Israel after the death of Solomon in 930 BC.
And to be honest, if you read Kings, it's kind of like, well, there was a king who did evil in the sight of the Lord, and then there's another king and he did good, and then there was a king who did evil in the sight of the Lord. I believe all the kings of the north are evil, and most of them in the south are evil. There's a few good ones in this really long period of time.
Yes.
And eventually we're going to get into well, you've told me this before, but there's a Syrian conquest in the north, I think in 722.
738 under Tiglath-Pileser.
738. Okay. Yep. And then the Babylonians come in to destroy the temple in 586. So again, we're in BC time, so we're moving closer to anyway. But so they were not well. They were, by this point, they were subject to being, defeated by other armies because they were not united. They were pulled apart, and political alliances play a role in us. But let's just use Ahab and Jezebel as a kind of last story that is really representative of what goes wrong with so many of the kings, and really a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, which is temptation to worship other gods, the inability to say no to neighboring religions, and just the sheer wickedness of some people. So let kind of tell their story, and I really think we should mention like Naboth's vineyard, because again, it's kind of like Nathan in what he says to David about Bathsheba, like the poor guy who had one sheep and you went in and took it. There's a real parallel there. So maybe just kind of, who are Ahab and Jezebel?
Ahab and Jezebel. So again, I mentioned his father Omri, Omri, and he was a king in Israel in the northern kingdom. They separated again under the death of Solomon, and they developed independently. They begin to grow apart. Now think about this. These are the 12 tribes of Israel. They should have been united. They should have been under one king, and they should have been brothers. They're fellow Israelites. Mm-hmm. So they should have existed coextensively. So Omri, because they do develop different politically, he starts to make some different political alliances with some of the kings in Syria, specifically in Damascus. And at one point, and again, I'm going to jump ahead here. This is Ahaz, not Ahab, but Ahaz. You've got Ahaz and Hezekiah. Ahaz actually does make this alliance with Tiglath-Pileser, this Assyrian king, because of the threat from the north. There is a threat. This is actually written about in Kings and also in Isaiah chapter 7 and 8. This is the episode in which the Messiah passage is actually mentioned in Isaiah. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. You should call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. That whole episode in Isaiah 7 and 8, and also in Kings, about Ahaz, and when he gets word that Israel had made this alliance with Syria and Rezin of Damascus, is really, I think, and I'll come back to Ahab and Jezebel in a second here, but I really think this Isaiah 7 is really the archetype, if you will, in the Old Testament of what an Israelite king, like a good example and a bad example. The bad example would be Ahaz. The good example would be Hezekiah. Of course, Ahab is also a bad example as well, because he allowed his wife, Jezebel, who was basically a Canaanite woman that he married for a political alliance, because his father, Omri, had made this alliance with Phoenicia, the Phoenicians that were living in the south. So in order to strengthen this political alliance with Phoenicia, he married Jezebel, who was a Canaanite woman. And we know from the archaeological record that the Phoenicians, as well as the Canaanites, worshipped a fertility goddess by the name of Asherah. And of course, the male version of that was Baal, or Baal, as we call him. And we learn about the Baal cycle from a site in Syria called Ugarit that was discovered in 1929 by a French archaeologist, and was excavated extensively. They found a lot of Ugaritic language and literature. So the Baal cycle has to do with fertility rites and fertility types of things. So we see the prophet Elijah come up and rise up during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel and speak out and preach against it. In fact, this all comes to a head when Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel in northern Israel. And the irony of this, and there's a whole lot to unpack here, is that Baal, according to the Baal cycle and according to Ugaritic literature, he is the god of thunder and lightning. He's a fertility god. So in order to have crops, in order to have successful crops, in order to have successful children, families, your life, everything is going to go great for you if you give homage to Baal and you practice Baal worship and Asherah worship. Then your life's going to go great. And this is what Jezebel had caused Israel to do. So then Elijah confronts the religious aspects of Ahab and Jezebel, and this comes to a head on Mount Carmel, in which basically the God of Israel, Yahweh, causes the lightning to come down on the sacrifice. The irony and the polemical angle of this is that it was Baal was the God who was supposed to be the one who brought the thunder and lightning, but he couldn't. He didn't. There's no power. In fact, Elijah even says, maybe he's asleep. Maybe he fell asleep.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a very powerful episode in the life of Israel, and of course, then you've got the episode with Naboth's vineyard, in which she wanted his vineyard, and of course, we see that eventually she didn't get it because God intervened in that whole affair, and she eventually was thrown out of a second-story window, I think it was, off the top of my head, and her blood was licked up by the dogs. Kind of a gross story.
But that was a kind of prophecy that was fulfilled, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. In fact, that goes back to, again, something we talked about Deuteronomy earlier, Evan. We're talking about the kings. There were actually principles for prophets also in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 22, where God basically says that if anybody claims to be a prophet and what he says does not come to pass, and he's not a prophet. So this is an example in this episode in which Jezebel's blood was licked up by the dogs that confirmed the message of the prophet. And then, of course, if it's okay to finish up with Hezekiah, this I think is a very powerful thing. I think this is really powerful because I actually lead trips here in Chicago to the Oriental Institute, and we have tons of artifacts that really show this passage to be really, really true. So in Isaiah 7, when you read, I'm going to summarize it here very quickly here, but in Isaiah 7, the text tells us that the people of Judah had gotten word that Pekah and the son of Remaliah, the kings in Israel, had made an alliance with Syria, the Syrians of Damascus. So then Ahaz goes to Isaiah the prophet, and he says, listen, we've gotten word that they have made this alliance with these Syrians, and they're going to come, they're going to kick me off the throne, they're going to take over Jerusalem. You need to do something about this. So Isaiah essentially says to Ahaz, no, it's not going to happen. You don't worry about it. And so he says, no, we have to do something about this. We need to go to the Assyrians and see if we can pay them money to protect us. This is actually in the Kings, not in the Isaiah passage.
Yeah.
But then Isaiah says, listen, here's the thing. Here's the deal. You just ask God for a sign that God's going to be with you. You're the king. In fact, he even says, hear now, O house of David. You are a son of David. You are a descendant of King David. You're supposed to be the one to trust me. If you just ask God for a sign that he's going to be with Judah, he will give you the sign, no matter what it is. You just ask him for the sign. So Ahaz says, I'm not going to ask God for a sign, which is basically saying I'm not going to trust God. And all the while, we actually learn in the King's passage that during this time he's talking to Isaiah the prophet, under the table, he's slipping money from the temple in Jerusalem to this Assyrian king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III. And so eventually, Isaiah essentially goes to Ahaz and says, listen, if you won't ask God for a sign, God himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. This is a child, a promise, a child that's going to be indicative that God's going to keep his promise to David and to Israel to protect them. And so again, this prophecy given in the 8th century BC is looking ahead also to ultimately the child that's going to be born, that God has not forgotten the covenant that he made with Israel. So it's very powerful. Another example of the grace of God. Ahaz didn't deserve it. Israel didn't deserve it because he wasn't trusting God. So instead of just letting him go, God says, I'm going to protect you anyway. And of course he did, but he did it through, of course, Tiglath-Pileser. But Isaiah warned him in Isaiah 8 that, listen, because you've done this now, you're going to allow the Assyrians in. They're going to be like the flood, and they're going to come overflow the banks, and they're going to destroy. And eventually they do. And in 738, they take Israel, 27,000 captives of Israel off into captivity in Assyria. And then eventually the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who is the third king after Tiglath-Pileser, actually comes into Judah to besiege Jerusalem and also laid siege to Lachish. And we have extensive archaeological evidence for this. In fact, it's one of the most well-attested historical events in the Old Testament. 701 BC, we have the Sennacherib prism here at the Oriental Institute. We have the Taylor Prism in the British Museum. One is in one is in Israel. We have Nineveh, the palace walls of Nineveh that speak about this as well. We have Lachish, the site of Lachish. In Jerusalem, King Hezekiah expanded the walls of Jerusalem to get ready for the Assyrians to onslaught, and we find this as well. So this is a great example. You've got two kings, one who trusted in his own power and unleashed Assyria into Judah, and another king who trusted God, King Hezekiah, and God protected Israel, or Judah rather. And so I think these two kings are really good examples of what God can do for a man who will trust him and believe him and take him at his word. I think that's really the message of the kings, is that what God wanted, and what God wanted Israel to learn, was that he wanted a man after his own heart, a man who would trust him and follow his word.
Yeah. And I'll go back to what I said to just end on this, go back to, looking at that passage in Deuteronomy and pushing it forward into, Timothy, which speaks again to overseers and deacons. But I think it's true of all men and women of God, men who seek after God's own heart, is that there's a kind of way of living, a way of trusting God that really God does desire above all things, which is actually a ton of grace. Because even in David, who did terrible things, but he did repent of what he did, and God received him. And so, that there's a lot of grace there for us, but we do have to go. We're a little bit over time, but that's okay. Ted, where can people find you? We mentioned Epic Archaeology earlier, but spell it out.
Yeah, epicarchaeology.org is our website. People can also find us on YouTube. Go to YouTube, just type in Epic Archaeology. You can hit subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're also on Instagram and Twitter as well, Facebook. They can find us on Facebook. Follow us and like us on Facebook. We post a lot of stuff on Facebook. And if you're in the Chicago area, we give tours to the Oriental Institute Museum at the University of Chicago throughout the summer. So check us out there as well. But thanks for having me on again, Evan.
Yeah, my seminary was LSTC on 55th Street.
Was it? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So, I taught guitar lessons at the University of Chicago Lab School for a while. So
very cool. I did not know that.
Walked down there many a time on many a cold day with my backpack, my guitar on my back. So, that's cool. Too bad I don't live there now. I could get a sweet tour of all that.
Good. So. That's right. I'd give you a free tour, brother.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor at First Lutheran here in Houston. As always, learn more about Houston Theology on Tap and upcoming events. Houston TOT is the place to go. Subscribe to our own YouTube channel. We're on Facebook. Like us there, and give us a good rating. We have low ratings on Facebook, so the haters have come out after us. I don't know that some people don't like that you mix beer and theology, I guess, but always in moderation. Always in moderation. So anyway, until next time, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.